In the recent history of this great state of Indiana, we discover that there was an attempt to censor the textbooks in colleges and high schools. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. David Detmer joins me in examining the politics and history of the book by Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. We will discuss questions of accuracy and logic and what it means for contemporary politics. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. David Detmer. We're going to discuss some aspects of the politics of history, specifically Howard Zinn and his book, People's History of the United States and Other Writings. Dr. Detmer is a Ph.D. in philosophy from Northwestern University, esteemed colleague in the philosophy department here at Purdue, written many books, articles, but the one we're talking about today is Zinnophobia, the battle over history, education, politics, and scholarship. And I guess for our viewers, we probably should talk first of all about how Zinn is both revered by many, but also critiqued by many. Maybe you can just kind of summarize where we are with Howard Zinn and why he becomes important.
Okay, fair enough. So for one thing, you mentioned his famous book, A People's History of the United States. It's a phenomenally successful book from a sales standpoint. It sold over 2.5 million copies, very rare for a history book, widely used in courses in colleges and high schools. And what makes it so very controversial is that the things he focuses on is very different from what you find in standard histories. So for example, the first chapter is about Columbus. And whereas the kind of history books I studied when I was in school, it would celebrate the courage of Columbus, what an intrepid navigator he was, whereas Zinn talks about how he enslaved and killed a number of Arawaks. He would do things like demand that they give him gold, and if they didn't, he would cut off their hands and they would bleed to death, things of that nature. And so his focus, it's called A People's History, so it doesn't have the same positive vibe, you might say, about our country's presidents and business leaders and military leaders.
Well, when you say people's history, that means the voices of it's not Howard Zinn's necessarily gloss. When I read it, I think it's like actually an Arawak history or somebody from the civil rights movement that was in the civil rights demonstrations or somebody
That's right.
had the voices of the people, so to speak.
That's right, the voices of the people. The book is studded with quotations from people like that. Yeah. And then another side of it is many traditional history books give you the impression that progress comes from the heroic and visionary deeds of the leaders. Whereas Zinn's view, he makes the case in the book that it tends to be people agitating for justice, agitating for change, creating a public demand, you might say, for change that the leaders then eventually ratify. So the focus is very different. Some people really like that. They see it as a corrective.
Well, it seems like it fits the concept of the United States democracy, the will of the people, the majority making decisions. It would seem that's why it's well received in many quarters.
That's right. Yeah. But then conversely, some people see it as anti-American, unpatriotic, because it does have negative information, you might say, unflattering information about some of our great leaders. Some people say, oh, you know, he's attacking all of our heroes. I think he presents a fairly balanced view of them. It's not just the negative stuff, but then he also suggests other heroes who aren't so much in the other history books.
The big names, not the big names, but the population.
Right.
So, okay, so we have People's History of the United States, a couple million readers, well regarded, but at the same time, it seems like the more reception there was, the more critiques came out.
That's right.
Your book has, I don't know, maybe 25 different people that have criticized Howard Zinn. So what was the controversy here in Indiana?
All right, the controversy here in Indiana, and this is what provoked me to work on this project. In 2013, there was an article carried by the Associated Press that a reporter for the Associated Press, through the Freedom of Information Act, had gotten access to emails that then Governor Mitch Daniels had written in 2010. And he, in those emails, had said, I don't like that book by Howard Zinn. I think it's a bad book. I don't think it should be taught for credit anywhere in Indiana. What can we do to make sure that it is not? And he sent this email out to several of his subordinates, and they looked into it and said, well, we see it's being used here at a course in Indiana University. And Mitch Daniels said, well, we've got to disqualify it. We can't have propaganda. So there was a lot of attention paid to this in the press. It was widely seen as an act of censorship and so on. And I write about this in the book. The first chapter is on that. But what became even more interesting to me is when he was subjected to criticism, he, in defending himself, said, oh, you don't have to take my view on it.
Many others.
Many other people who criticize Zinn, and he points out correctly, not all of them right-wingers. Some people on the left and in the center.
I know that there was some in there that I would. So many of the people that you write about in here would be somebody that Mitch Daniels and others would refer to as other scholars that are making these scholarly critiques.
That's
of Zinn.
right. And so when I saw this list he gave of other scholars who had criticized Zinn, I started reading their work, and I started noticing all kinds of rather spectacular flaws in what they were doing. And let me just give you an example or two when I say spectacular flaws, so you'll know what I'm talking about. So one of them, Sean Wilentz, who's a distinguished historian at Princeton, a very elite university. And he said, Howard Zinn, he doesn't have anything good to say about any U.S. president. They're all just stinkers. And then this is an exact quote. He said, Lincoln freed the slaves, but you'd never learn that from Howard Zinn. So then I opened up A People's History to the chapter on the Civil War. The first page contains the following sentence, and I quote, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. So that's not a C- in a freshman class. And this is a Princeton historian. And so I found this over and over and over again. David Greenberg, a historian at Rutgers University.
A communication professor. I actually know David.
Oh, you know David Greenberg.
I was not surprised with what you
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all right. So he said, well, Zinn has these criticisms of the U.S., but, and now I quote, he seems to have stayed silent on the Soviet Union. So in my book, I then have a string of quotations from Zinn about the Soviet Union in which he says things like dictatorship, despotic, murderous, totalitarian. I challenge David Greenberg. Well, actually, he's not saying he said anything nice. He's saying he seems to have stayed silent. But there are dozens and dozens of quotations harshly critical. And then you have to wonder, how does someone write a sentence like that? If you're going to say someone has stayed silent on a subject, you'd have to at least look and see whether that's true. And these statements that I quote, they're in A People's History, they're in other well-known books. You look up Soviet Union in the index, you'll find them. It wouldn't take much scholarly work. Again, a freshman paper, that's not a C-. And this is a scholar at the Rutgers University.
So you started by saying there were some spectacular missteps?
Yes.
I just wondered if there was a theme across these 24 or so critics. I mean, would there in general be a lack of connection to Zinn's actually writing? So
yes.
There were always charges that could easily be refuted by.
That's right. It's as if what he's doing is just so incomprehensible to them that they're not capable of reading it. That they're not capable of getting what he's saying. So I'll give you another example. Sam Weinberg, he's a historian at Stanford, another elite university. And he says, well, the main problem with Zinn's book is that it's just very dogmatic. He doesn't admit that some things are uncertain. And so at one point he says, so he won't use any qualifying phrases. He extinguishes words like maybe and perhaps. So unfortunately for Professor Weinberg, the book is available online where it's easy to do a little search. And so I've got in my book, here are the 130 times he uses the word perhaps. Here's the 118 times he uses the word maybe, and so on. Then you look through Weinberg's article where he makes all these charges against Zinn. There's not a maybe or a perhaps to be found. He just dogmatically comes out and asserts falsehoods without even suggesting that they might be wrong. So There's almost something psychiatrically interesting about these critiques, because what they accuse Zinn of tend to be precisely the errors that they themselves make. So like in the case of Weinberg, accusing him of not acknowledging ambiguity and the possibility of error, when in fact he makes errors and doesn't acknowledge the possibility of doing so. Or again, the issue of factual errors. I noticed that several of these Zinn critics will say, oh, the book is larded with factual errors, but then they either don't name any, or they'll name one or two, and then these one or two are easily debunked. So anyway.
I think it's one of the things I like about your book and the essays kind of refuting or answering some of the critics is you don't try to answer the question of why they do this. Because I think the first step, I would say, in scholarship, and I would say that was maybe something that Zinn was proposing to people that are critiques, is not so much the why as let's see if we can be accurate. Let's see if we can find out where we're disagreeing so we can actually have a conversation. So
I'm glad you picked up on that, because many people that I've talked to about my research on this, that's the first thing they ask me. They said, well, why did they do this? Why did they make all those mistakes? And I would say, well, I don't say much about that in the book because that's not something I can prove. That's speculation. Whereas I can prove they've got it wrong. I can prove if they say he never says maybe, but he says it 130 times, or he never says Lincoln freed the slaves, but he does. I can prove that. Why they make those mistakes, that's speculation, so I don't say much about that in the book.
I guess the larger question is, in the climate we live in, and we've probably lived in it not just since the election, I'd say probably a couple decades. This question of, well, that's your opinion, and this is my opinion, or that's your truth, and this is my truth, and it all becomes relative. So in here, it seems to me that that's kind of the subtext. Well, maybe it's the exclusive part of your text, but it's a subtext to the critiques of Zinn, that somehow a difference of opinion is sufficient for me to lay out these claims, and the accuracy or the validity or the reliability is secondary to that. So it raises the question of scholarship. I mean, if you're a scholar, these people are scholars, Zinn is a scholar. So for somebody that isn't a scholar per se, it sounds like, well, you're just having this disagreement over things that we can't come to any agreement on.
Well, see, here's the thing I want to say. Several things I want to say about that. So one is, in the world of scholarship, usually you don't find the kinds of criticisms of Zinn that I found. Usually it's more, all right, you've got your theory, I think I can analyze the data a little bit differently and come up with a different. It's not, you're a fraud, you're an incompetent. I didn't focus on criticisms of Zinn that are sort of in the normal scholarly area. I'm focusing on these people who say Zinn's terrible, because those are the kind of criticisms that Mitch Daniels was relying on. So that already kind of takes us out of that normal realm. But then the other thing I wanted to say about the relativism aspect, one thing that has gotten Zinn into trouble, and I have a whole chapter on this, chapter 2 of the book talks about this, is he has several times admitted that he is, quote, biased, and he's also said that he is not trying to be, quote, objective. And so the critics have really pilloried him on this, and what's been unfortunate about it is they haven't taken the trouble to talk about what he meant by it. So when he talked about bias, the point he was making there is that in historical writing, it's necessarily going to be selective. You can't include everything. Some things you're going to include, other things you leave out, some things you emphasize, others you de-emphasize. And then there's a question of why you do that. And so he says, so I've got some principled reasons why I emphasize some things and not others. That's what he meant by bias. He did not mean at all that there was some kind of license to not be accurate or not be fair.
That would be my question. Bias or even partisan objectivity doesn't seem to me to be something that refutes scholarship.
Exactly.
I mean, you say I'm biased for life and I'm opposed to death. Does that mean anything that you say now about the quality of life must be dismissed because you're favoring life? I mean,
that's an excellent point. So for example, medical researchers, they're for health, they're against disease. Yes. They've got values that guide their research. But if they're going to come up with cures and treatments for disease, they better be objective in the sense of being accurate. And so this is a point that Zinn makes over and over again, and the critics don't really engage that. They just sort of notice that he uses the term bias and uses the term objectivity, and they go after him. So if I can just give one example, going back to the Columbus thing, one of the points that Zinn makes in A People's History, the first chapter, he cites Samuel Eliot Morison, a Harvard historian who is probably the most distinguished Columbus scholar. And so in one of Morison's books, he has a sentence right in the middle of the book about Columbus's treatment of American Indians or Native Americans, whatever term you want to use. And he says, Columbus's cruel policy toward the Indians amounted to genocide. And so Zinn makes the point, Morison doesn't ignore this, nor does he sugarcoat it. He uses the harshest word you can use, genocide, but it's one sentence in a 500-page book that otherwise emphasizes the good qualities. So Zinn's point is that's where values come in. What's important to emphasize, what's not as important, and his emphases are different than traditional history, and that's something that's made a lot of people mad, partly for political reasons, and then some historians who are not so politically right-wing, there might be an element of professional conservatism, not so much political, but professional. He's doing history differently than I was taught to do it.
That somehow by staying neutral, I don't take a side here.
Yeah.
My research or my scholarship will be, what, more pristine or more acceptable? I mean, perhaps
That's right. So in my chapter, I've got a chapter in the book, chapter 2, which talks about bias and objectivity in history, addressing these issues, and I draw a threefold distinction with regard to objectivity. So there's objectivity as accuracy,
yes,
which I think is the primary one. And then there are two other things that people call objectivity that I argue are in conflict with objectivity as accuracy. So one would be objectivity as neutrality. And the idea is, look, sometimes the facts and the data point in one direction rather than another. So if you have this sort of principled commitment, I'm not going to take a side on anything, that's actually inconsistent with accurately following facts.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that's a confusion. And then the third one is objectivity as centrism. Some people sort of have this idea. There will be people who will say, oh, you know, I'm against propaganda on the left or on the right. And I'll sometimes say, what about propaganda of the center? And they sort of don't even know what that means. So that's just a conceptual confusion. You know, if you are if you are committed in an a priori way that no matter what the facts are, the right thing to do is to come out in the middle of some spectrum of opinion, then you're doing violence to the evidence. And so Zinn tends not to come down in the middle of the spectrum of mainstream American political thought, and so that in and of itself is then seen as not objective. But I would say that's confusing objectivity as accuracy with objectivity as centrism.
Right, and it would probably be reinforced by not being able to find a whole slew of inaccuracies in Zinn's account.
Yes.
Right, because it would seem like if I'm going to charge you with, okay, objectivity, you're not being objective. Well,
yeah,
part of what I would need to do is show that the data or the evidence or the empirical anecdotes even are not consistent with your position.
Right.
I mean, at a minimum, I should be able to show that your objectivity has clouded your judgment, so there's an inaccuracy, there's an inconsistency, it's not valid, you quoted somebody that wasn't there, things of that nature.
So that's kind of what's really amazing about this. Mitch Daniels, when this scandal first happened, he actually said, A People's History misstates American history on every page. Now, it's a 688-page book, so it ought to be easy to come up with a long list of errors. Now, in going through all of these different writers, the longest list of factual errors I ever found that anyone even claimed was in Oscar Handlin. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard historian. He wrote a review of the book in The American Scholar, and he charged Zinn with 9 errors. And I went through it in my book, and I think clearly Zinn was right on 8 out of the 9. I think Handlin was right about 1, that was an error in the first edition, which was immediately corrected in all subsequent editions. They would take too long to go through the details on that. But he gave 9. What most of them do is they give 0. They say, oh, he made a whole bunch of factual errors. I'm not going to tell you what they are. Or they'll give 1 or 2 that are easily debunked.
Which seems very poor scholarship. If
Exactly.
I make a claim that you were wrong, David, in the last 3 sentences, but I'm not going to talk to you about it because you're so unobjective, you wouldn't have noticed it anyway.
Yeah.
It kind of suggests that the viewers should pick up a copy of People's History of the United States and look and read for themselves to see, and then check those claims that he may make or the quotes that he has.
Yeah.
And also pick up your book to see what the charges are, and then it's kind of an assignment that you would give in a freshman philosophy class.
That's right.
Do this. So it's not Dr. David Detmer making this charge. There's your evidence, which is what seems like scholarship would do.
And in my book, I was very aware of the possibility of people pushing back against what I'm doing. So I was very conscientious about documenting everything I say. So pretty much all of Zinn's critics, I quote them verbatim. I tell you exactly what publication to find it in, what page number to find it in, what page number to find the relevant Zinn text in. It's all there so it can be verified.
This sure seems at odds with the standard understanding of a philosopher, though.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Which is, we don't have a lot of time, but I just wondered you'd broach this question of how does a philosopher find this question of historical accuracy and its effect on politics to be of significance, and maybe embedded within there you could talk about what you see as a role, both of as a philosopher and a scholar, to actually be engaged in politics and issues of the day.
Well, yes. Sure. I mean, I think everybody should be engaged in politics. That's everyone's responsibility. And political philosophy is, one of the main branches of philosophy, of course. And as far as my interest in this project, that this is my 5th book. The other 4 are all very much within the field of philosophy. This is sort of the first one that's in a different field, history. But one of the things philosophers are interested in is truth claims and drawing conclusions based on evidence. And so I was just so amazed to discover that there were so many reckless claims being made that were not backed up by evidence. And the more I found this, the more I felt, well, I've got to publicize this. I've got to put this into a book. So that's a big part of how this happened.
So the philosopher in you wants to understand the construction of knowledge and how we view the world.
That's right.
And the public intellectual in you wants to be able to be engaged in, well, today we talk about fake news or we talk about propaganda. So does this give us any insight to how the daily news is? When you talked about centrism, I think of the New York Times or the Washington Post, where I would argue they're biased to the center.
Yeah.
Like we're going to give both sides, you shot somebody, he got shot, but let's give both sides. And it's somehow they come out more objective. Does that do a disservice to our understanding?
Oh, it certainly does. Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess it relates to Zinn in the following way. It's a fallacy, and I think you articulated it well, to think that there are 2 sides to every issue. There are many issues where there are more than 2 positions which, given the current state of evidence, are worthy of consideration, not just 2. Conversely, there are some where there's really only 1. So it's sort of a distortion to say there are 2 legitimate sides. Global warming would be a case in point. It's sort of a pseudo debate, pretending that there's a significant case to be made for the other side. So how that maybe relates to Zinn is some of the things that he's saying are outside of the spectrum of mainstream political thought.
Accepted mainstream.
So it's like, well, this isn't either one of the 2 both sides, so it must be crazy, nutty, goofy land. So I think that's part of it.
Yes, we're often, when we get the frames, you're talking about historical frames or media frames or political frames. When you're outside that frame, it's almost dismissed because you aren't within the parameters of what Chomsky would say is accepted discourse.
Sure.
So you're dismissed. And, and Zinn was clearly outside there.
Yeah.
But it's probably what the contribution is to our understanding of history. What do you have planned next?
Well, in fact, I've already written another book, although my publisher wants me to add to it, which is always nice. And this is a book on the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. I've written on him before, so this is another book on that. So maybe when that's out, I can come back and talk about that one.
The question of existentialism in U.S. history would be an interesting conversation.
Yes, indeed.
Well, thank you, Dr. Detmer, for joining us today. I'm sure we could have another 30 minutes of conversation, and I'm sure we'll be able to talk to you again. But that's all the time we have on our program today. So I want to thank Dr. Detmer for joining me on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.